Now, IQ scores. This one came up because, we don't really dig into the corners of the internet. We just don't really need to do that. But every so often something pops up because we have to pay attention to conversations on the far right. And I'll be transparent. I do it probably more than I should. And Q has a pretty pretty healthy relationship with far right propaganda because he protects his peace a lot better than I do, and I'm still learning from you, Q. But either way, we do have to into this stuff. We have to know kind of what these people are thinking, talking about, saying, right? In order to have conversations that we feel will be fruitful and that might penetrate, maybe. Okay. So I'm going to share a bit. This comes from Quora, right? The online forum where people post questions and the other people answer them. So this is not, well sourced, but it does present an interesting question and an interesting thought-provoking response, which Q and I are prepared to discuss. So the question posted says, don't most blacks have a lower IQ than whites? Do you believe in evolution? Blacks look different, as do Asians and Caucasians. Evolution doesn't stop with skin pigment. Okay, that's the question. The answer, the irony here is extremely painful. Suppressing the urge to engage in ad hominem, Thomas Sowell discovered old military mental test results. Quote, differences in mental test scores among different racial and ethnic groups were taken as proof of genetic differences in innate mental ability during the progressive era in the early 20th century. Progressives regarded the fact that the average IQ test score among whites was higher than the average among blacks as conclusive proof of genetic determinism. Okay. We talk a lot about data and misinterpreting data and cognitive bias and so forth on this show. So allow me to continue. The answer continues. A closer look at mental health data, however, shows that there were not only individual blacks with higher IQs than most whites, but also whole categories of whites who scored at or below the mental test scores of blacks. Among American soldiers given mental tests during the First World War, for example, white soldiers from Georgia, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Mississippi scored lower on mental tests than black soldiers from Ohio, Illinois, New York, and Pennsylvania. Among other groups of whites, those with average mental test scores no higher than the average mental test score among blacks included those in various isolated mountain communities in the United States, those living in the Hebrides Islands off Scotland, and those in isolated canal boat communities in Britain. Looking at achievements in general, people living in geographically isolated environments around the world have long lagged behind the progress of people with a wider cultural universe, regardless of the race of the people in these isolated places. When the Spaniards discovered the Canary Islands in the 15th century, they found people of a Caucasian race living at Stone Age level. That's about all I'm willing to give on this question. Using common sense, you'll only be able to determine this properly if everyone is equally given a good education that is consistent across the board and over a substantial period of time. And I don't think we have ever seen that. There are definitely many, many, many black people with higher IQs than you. Okay. I'm going to just read one more thing, Q, and then I want you to jump in. But to provide context for folks who might have heard this, might believe this, or are susceptible to this type of rhetoric, black people are less intelligent, whatever. I'm going to share this. This is from the BBC. Being poor can sap a person's mental resources, research published in the Journal of Science suggests. The work, external by an international team, demonstrates how poverty takes its toll on cognitive function, leaving less mental capacity for other tasks. The evidence comes from 2 studies carried out in India and the US. Previous data had shown a link between poverty and bad decision-making, but the root causes of this correlation were unclear. The US, British, and Canadian team tried to shed light on this chicken and egg puzzle by isolating the financial factor from others that might interfere with the results. One part of the study used the natural financial cycle tied to the crop cycle of sugarcane farmers in India. The farmers go through 3 crucial stages in the cycle: before the harvest, when they have taken out loans to grow the crops and thus are extremely poor, and then after the harvest but before being paid, when farmers are at the greatest extent of their poverty and after being paid. Okay. So, you can read the rest of the article if you want, but suffice it to say that there's a cycle embedded in the farmer's fiscal year that affects their cognitive abilities, their capacity to score higher on IQ tests, right? Now, I did some additional research here. Last thing I'll share. And I have it written down, so I'll just read it. Besides genetics, because this is the argument for, white supremacists, people that are racist, so forth, is to suggest somehow that white people are genetically superior and intellectually superior based on their whiteness or their genetics, right? So besides genetics, environmental factors such as socioeconomic status, education, nutrition is a big one, okay? Early childhood experiences, traumas, etc., prenatal factors, physical exercise, age, health, stress, sleep deprivation, and exposure to toxins. Read about environmental racism. All have been known to affect IQ. Okay? So I wanted to share this. This is how you get people from like Appalachia, largely white communities, score lower tests, IQ tests, or people who live in food deserts, black communities around the country, or whatever. And so there are factors beyond your genetics that affect your capacity to learn and to grow. I know you know all this stuff, Q, but I just want to get your thoughts here.
We brought up this topic before.
A while ago, yeah.
And I remember not wanting to talk about it because I just thought the question was ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like, begging the question of seriously considering a genetic genome-based lack of intellect because of the melanin in your skin today should be a ridiculous thing to ask out loud.
Yeah.
Even back when this question was being begged, it was with intent. And we've used the words pseudoscience, which I hate because it makes it sound like a science. It makes it sound
bogus science,
some legitimacy. It was just insanity. It wasn't science at all. We're going to prove a conclusion that we've already reached by creating our own data and our own subsets and no peer review. And if it is peer review, it's somebody who already agrees with me before we even started. Like, it's just like,
there's nothing scientific about the process.
There's no scientific method or process in tied to it. And again, I think when everyone knows the answer to the question before we ask it, then asking it is a waste of time.
Mm-hmm.
And both sides of the argument knew the answer before we asked it. So it's a frustrating thing to ever have been pondered. But the same people that used God and Jesus to justify slavery and kidnapping and human trafficking pose these kind of questions, all to justify the same things, right? We can prove that they're less than human, that they're less than us, that they deserve this awful treatment, and or that we tamed and trained the savages so they benefited from the way that we treated them. We can feel better about ourselves, and our children can smile in the pictures as we pose next to the most heinous things that we've ever done to other human beings at picnics of all places. So entertaining this with even a modicum of actual question mark, like we don't already know, was kind of an annoying idea to me. But I think, as my brother would typically say, sometimes you have to say the ridiculous things out loud, reframe them as ridiculous so that people don't get caught up in pondering whether or not this is something they should ever consider. So no one else has to ponder this. We did it for you. You're welcome.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll give a little bit of a peek behind the curtain. I wouldn't say kicking and screaming, but when this came up for us to discuss, Q was very much like, do we need to do that again? Because I understand it, because it's like, by taking it seriously and talking about it, it's almost like we're dignifying it, or we're giving it a modicum of credibility which it doesn't deserve. But the fact is, there are some people who might feel that way, and they might end up in your life, and hopefully now you know how to engage with them. So